Martha had given me the note with Miss Pole's kind regards, it needed no wizard to find out who sent it, and if the writer's name was to be kept secret, it was very well that I was alone when Martha delivered it. I went as requested to Miss Pole's. The door was opened to me by her little maid Lizzie in Sunday trim, as if some grand event was impending over this work-day. And the drawing-room upstairs was arranged in accordance with this idea. The table was set out with the best green-card cloth and writing materials upon it. On the little chiffonier was a tray with a newly decanted cowslip wine and some ladies' finger biscuits. Miss Pole herself was in solemn array, as if to receive visitors, although it was only 11 o'clock. Miss Forrester was there, crying quietly and sadly, and my arrival seemed only to call forth fresh tears. Before we had finished our greetings, performed with lugubrious mystery of demeanor, there was another rat-tat-tat, and Miss Fitzadam appeared, crimson with walking and excitement. It seemed as if this was all the company expected, for now Miss Pole made several demonstrations of being about to open the business of the meeting by stirring the fire, opening and shutting the door, and coughing and blowing her nose. Then she arranged us all around the table, taking care to place me opposite to her, and last of all, she inquired of me if the sad report was true, as she feared it was, that Miss Matty had lost all her fortune. Of course, I had but one answer to make, and I never saw more unaffected sorrow depicted on any countenance than I did there on the three before me. "I wish Miss Jameson was here," said Mrs. Forrester at last, but to judge from Miss Fitzadam's face, she could not second the wish. "But without Miss Jameson," said Miss Pole, with just a sound of offended merit in her voice, "we, the ladies of Cranford, in my drawing-room assembled, can resolve upon something. I imagine we are none of us what may be called rich, though we all possess a genteel competency, sufficient for tastes that are elegant and refined, and would not, if they could, be vulgarly ostentatious." Here I observed Miss Pole refer to a small card concealed in her hand, on which I imagine she had put down a few notes. "Miss Smith, I have conversed in private. I made it my business to do so yesterday afternoon, with these ladies on the misfortune which was happened to our friend, and one and all of us have agreed that while we have a superfluity, it is not only a duty, but a pleasure, a true pleasure, Mary." Her voice was rather choked just here, and she had to wipe her spectacles before she could go on, to give what we can to assist her, Miss Matilda Jenkins. Only in consideration of the feelings of delicate independence existing in the mind of every refined female. I was sure she had got back to the card now. We wished to contribute our mites in a secret and concealed manner, so as not to hurt the feelings I have referred to. And our object in requesting you to meet us this morning is that, believing you are the daughter, that your father is, in fact, her confident adviser in all pecuniary matters, we imagine that by consulting with him, you might devise some mode in which our contribution can be made to appear the legal due which Miss Matilda Jenkins ought to receive from, probably your father, knowing her investments, can fill up the blank. Miss Pole concluded her address, and looked round for approval and agreement. "I have expressed your meaning, ladies, have I not? And while Miss Smith considers what reply to make, allow me to offer you some little refreshment." I had no great reply to make. I had more thankfulness at my heart for their kind thoughts than I cared to put into words, and so I only mumbled out something to the effect that I would name what Miss Pole had said to my father, and that if anything could be arranged for dear Miss Matty, and here I broke down utterly, and had to be refreshed with a glass of cowslip wine before I could check the crying which had been repressed for the last 2 or 3 days. The worst was all the ladies cried in concert. Even Miss Pole cried, who had said 100 times that to betray emotion before anyone was a sign of weakness and want of self-control. She recovered herself into a slight degree of impatient anger, directed against me as having set them all off, and moreover, I think she was vexed that I could not make a speech back in return for hers, and if I had known beforehand what was to be said, and had a card on which to express the probable feelings that would rise in my heart, I would have tried to gratify her. As it was, Miss Forrester was the person to speak when we had recovered our composure. "I don't mind, among friends, stating that no, I'm not poor exactly, but I don't think I'm what you may call rich. I wish I were, for dear Miss Matty's sake. But If you please, I'll write down in a sealed paper what I can give. I only wish it was more. My dear Mary, I do indeed. Now I saw why paper, pens, and ink were provided. Every lady wrote down the sum she could give annually, signed the paper, and sealed it mysteriously. If their proposal was acceded to, my father was to be allowed to open the papers, under pledge of secrecy. If not, they were to be returned to their writers. When the ceremony had been gone through, I rose to depart, but each lady seemed to wish to have a private conference with me. Miss Pole kept me in the drawing-room to explain why, in Miss Jamieson's absence, she had taken the lead in this movement, as she was pleased to call it, and also to inform me that she had heard from good sources that Mrs. Jamieson was coming home directly in a state of high displeasure against her sister-in-law, who was forthwith to leave her house, and was, she believed, to return to Edinburgh that very afternoon. Of course, this piece of intelligence could not be communicated before Miss Fitzadam, more especially as Miss Pole was inclined to think that Lady Glenmire's engagement to Mr. Hoggins could not possibly hold against the blaze of Miss Jamieson's displeasure. A few hearty inquiries after Miss Matty's health concluded my interview with Miss Pole. On coming downstairs, I found Miss Forrester waiting for me at the entrance to the dining parlor. She drew me in, and when the door was shut, she tried 2 or 3 times to begin on some subject, which was so unapproachable, apparently, that I began to despair of our ever getting to a clear understanding. At last out it came, the poor old lady trembling all the time as if it were a great crime which she was exposed to daylight, and telling me how very, very little she had to live upon, a confession which she was brought to make from a dread lest we should think that a small contribution named in her paper bore any proportion to her love and regard for Miss Matty. And yet that sum which she so eagerly relinquished was, in truth, more than a 20th part of what she had to live upon, and keep house, and a little serving maid, all as to become one born a Tyrrell. And when the whole income does not nearly amount to £100, to give up a 20th of it will necessitate many careful economies, and many pieces of self-denial, small and insignificant in the world's account, but bearing a different value in another account book that I have heard of. She did so wish she was rich, she said, and this wish she kept repeating with no thought of herself in it, only with a longing, yearning desire to be able to heap up Miss Matty's measure of comforts. It was some time before I could console her enough to leave her, and then, on quitting the house, I was waylaid by Miss Fitzadam, who had also her confidence to make of pretty nearly the opposite description. She had not liked to put down all that she could afford, and was ready to give. She told me she thought she never could look Miss Matty in the face again if she presumed to be giving her so much as she should like to do. Miss Matty, continued she, that I thought was such a fine young lady when I was nothing but a country girl, coming to market with eggs and butter and such like things. For my father, though well-to-do, would always make me go on as my mother had done before me, and I had to come into Cranford every Saturday and see after sales and prices and what not. And one day, I remember, I met Miss Matty in the lane that leads to Combhurst. She was walking on the footpath, which, you know, is raised a good way above the road, and a gentleman rode beside her, and was talking to her, and she was looking down at some primroses she had gathered, and pulling them all to pieces, and I do believe she was crying. But after she had passed, she turned round and ran after me to ask, oh so kindly, about my poor mother, who lay on her deathbed, and when I cried she took hold of my hand to comfort me, and the gentleman waiting for her all the time, and her poor heart very full of something, I am sure. And I thought it such an honor to be spoken to in that pretty way by the rector's daughter, who visited at Arley Hall. I have loved her ever since, though perhaps I'd no right to do it. But if you can think of any way in which I might be allowed to give a little more without anyone knowing it, I should be so much obliged to you, my dear. And my brother would be delighted to doctor her for nothing, medicines, leeches, and all. I know that he and her ladyship, my dear, would do anything for her. We all would. I told her I was quite sure of it, and promised all sorts of things in my anxiety to get home to Miss Matty, who might well be wondering what had become of me, absent from her 2 hours without being able to account for it. She had taken very little note of time, however, as she had been occupied in numberless little arrangements preparatory to the great step of giving up her house. It was evidently a relief to her to be doing something in the way of retrenchment, for, as she said, whenever she paused to think, the recollection of the poor fellow with his bad 5-pound note came over her, and she felt quite dishonest. Only if it made her so uncomfortable, what must it not be doing to the directors of the bank, who must know so much more of the misery consequent upon this failure? She almost made me angry by dividing her sympathy between these directors, whom she imagined overwhelmed by self-reproach for the mismanagement of other people's affairs, and those who were suffering like her. Indeed, of the two, she seemed to think poverty a lighter burden than self-reproach, but I privately doubted if the directors would agree with her. Old hoards were taken out and examined as to their money value, which luckily was small, or else I don't know how Miss Matty would have prevailed upon herself to part with such things as her mother's wedding ring, the strange, uncouth brooch with which her father had disfigured his shirt frill. However, we arranged things in a little order as to their estimation, and were all ready for my father when he came the next morning. I'm not going to weary you with the details of all the business we went through, and one reason for not telling about them is that I did not understand what we were doing at the time, and cannot recollect it now. Miss Matty and I sat assenting to accounts and schemes and reports and documents, of which I do not believe we either of us understood a word, for my father was clear-headed and decisive, and a capital man of business, and if we made the slightest inquiry, or expressed the slightest want of comprehension, he had a sharp way of saying, it's as clear as daylight. What's your objection? And as we had not comprehended anything of what he had proposed, we found it rather difficult to shape our objections. In fact, we were never sure if we had any. So presently Miss Matty got into a nervously acquiescent state, and said yes, and certainly, at every pause, whether required or not. But when I once joined in as chorus to a decidedly, pronounced by Miss Matty in a trembling, dubious tone, my father fired round at me and asked me what there was to decide, and I am sure to this day I have never known. But, in justice to him, I must say he had come over from Drumble to help Miss Matty when he could ill spare the time, and when his own affairs were in a very anxious state. While Miss Matty was out of the room giving orders for luncheon, and sadly perplexed between her desire of honoring my father by a delicate, dainty meal, and her conviction that she had no right, now that all her money was gone, to indulge this desire, I told him of the meeting of the Cranford ladies at Miss Pole's the day before. He kept brushing his hand before his eyes as I spoke, and when I went back to Martha's offer the evening before of receiving Miss Matty as a lodger, he fairly walked away from me to the window and began drumming with his fingers upon it. Then he turned abruptly round and said, "See, Mary, how a good, innocent life makes friends all around. Confound it, I could make a good lesson out of it if I were a parson, but as it is, I can't get it tell to my sentences. Only I'm sure you feel what I want to say. You and I will have a walk after lunch and talk a bit more about these plans." The lunch, a hot savory mutton chop, and a little of the cold loin sliced and fried, was now brought in. Every morsel of this last dish was finished, to Martha's great gratification. Then my father bluntly told Miss Matty he wanted to talk to me alone, and that he would stroll out and see some of the old places, and then I could tell her what plan we thought desirable. Just before we went out, she called me back and said, "Remember, dear, I'm the only one left. I mean, there's no one to be hurt by what I do. I'm willing to do anything that's right and honest, and I don't think, if Deborah knows where she is, she'll care so very much if I'm not genteel, because, you see, she'll know all, dear. Only let me see what I can do, and pay the poor people as far as I'm able." I gave her a hearty kiss and ran after my father. The result of our conversation was this. If all parties were agreeable, Martha and Jim were to be married with as little delay as possible, and they were to live on Miss Matty's present abode, the sum which the Cranford ladies had agreed to contribute annually being sufficient to meet the greater part of the rent, and leaving Martha free to appropriate what Miss Matty should pay for her lodgings to any little extra comforts required. About the cell, my father was dubious at first. He said the old rectory furniture, however carefully used and reverently treated, would fetch very little, and that little would be but as a drop in the sea of the debts of the town and county bank. But when I represented how Miss Matty's